Welcome to another edition of Against the Current. I'm Dan Proft, co-host of Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, weekdays 5 to 9 a.m. on AM 560, as I said. We're coming to you from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic building, as we always do, and pleased to have as my guest on this edition, philosophy professor Jason Hill, professor of philosophy at DePaul University. Professor Hill, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So you wrote this piece that really sparked a lot of interest. It's a piece that you wrote for Commentary Magazine in response to a piece that was written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's kind of a celebrated left intellectual who spends a lot of his time writing about African-American families. Frankly, I would characterize it as identity politics. That's really his particular perspective. And he wrote a piece that suggested that the American dream is not only a fraud, it's vicious. It's actually, the American dream is something that's predatory. It's almost like this is a lie perpetrated by white Americans on black Americans to keep them down. That's kind of the gist that I took away from it. And you provided a response that was extensive, that both was personal to your experience coming to this country from Jamaica 30 plus years ago, as well as an intellectual response to the quality of the arguments he was making from your perspective as an intellectual, as an academic. Give me a sense of what you thought Coates is saying and how reflective his viewpoint is of this discussion about the American dream and equality of economic opportunity in this country, and then why you chose to respond to it the way you did.
Well, I chose to respond to it the way I did because I thought he was a liar, first of all. That I thought that he was trying to make the American dream a constitutive feature of white supremacy and racism. And I thought that America is not a white supremacist country anymore because we don't have an official ideology in this country that promotes the superiority of the white race as we once did. So that's, first of all, a nefarious and specious lie. And secondly, he was trying in some sense to make the American dream a dream that was one that was fabricated by white people that exploited blacks. So the American dream was not a dream that was inclusive of the hopes and aspirations of black people themselves and of immigrants, but one that was the exclusive monopoly of white people who had constructed it as their own coercive force in the world to be used as a means to extract labor, exploit neighborhoods, destroy lives. In his words, it was the enemy of all art, of all courageous thinking. And I thought this was false. I thought this was very dangerous, that the American dream is and remains a very constitutive feature of the American identity. If you take away and you destroy the American dream, you destroy the very core of who and what America stands for. It is part of the aspirational identity of many, many people such as myself who've come here to achieve and make something substantial of their lives, and perhaps not so substantial, but just to make something of their lives. It is a crucible in which is forged aspirational identities, and it is in the name of the best within ourselves that we find who we want to become. That is the American dream. I thought what angered me also was that Ta-Nehisi Coates was being very hypocritical. This is the only country in the world, by the way, in which a black man can tell off far-left liberals that they are racist, that they're horrible people, and they reward him with a National Book Award prize, millions of dollars in royalties.
Yeah, well.
And he has made the dream.
That's the nature of what Shelby Steele would call white guilt.
Yes, yeah. He's living the dream and then writes a letter to his son telling him to extricate himself from the dream, to demonize the dream. And I thought this sort of moral corruption, that's the kindest word I can think of, that he inhabits and that he wants to pass off to his son and to my students also, who are primarily his readers, liberal, progressive whites whom I teach at DePaul. It was just a very dangerous thing that I had to stop.
Well, and so it seems to me that he took it a step beyond you didn't build that, right? He took it to you cannot build that, which is kind of where the left has gone, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or whether it's Ta-Nehisi Coates, that it's not only you didn't build that if you built something, if you achieve something approximating the so-called American dream, but it's not possible to achieve it I mean, unless except it's provided to you, the path is gilded by Elizabeth Warren or Ta-Nehisi Coates on their own terms, right? Unless they can leverage the power of the state
Yes.
to impose their will. That's the only way that there's a path to what they would call, perhaps what they would call the American dream.
That's right. And so he dismisses, just in the context of Black lives, for example, he dismisses something like Black entrepreneurship and the creation of Black wealth in this country that existed from the inception of this country. What about those stories? What about the stories of immigrants that I've told, that I've described in the piece? Poor immigrants who came over to this country, not middle-class immigrants such as myself, but poor immigrants who came over to this country with nothing but a burning drive and initiative and grit, honor, tenacity, perseverance, and willpower. And through sheer resilience have made it. What about those stories? Are they anomalies? Are they aberrations? Are their stories to be cast aside as nothing but exceptions and not part of the real stories of American mythology that constitutes part of the American dream? And he took himself as a deputized stand-in. This is what also annoyed me. He took himself as a deputized stand-in for the Black male experience. And I thought, how dare he? He doesn't speak for me. And he doesn't speak for all Black American males also who were born in this country, whom I happen to know personally, and who resent enormously having this very privileged, I might add, Black person who's awarded with all sorts of accolades by white people, white liberals, to speak on their behalf. And also what struck me as hypocritical in his book was that the fear that he experienced in his book was not fear inflicted on him by white people. When you read his book very carefully, the fear that he experienced in his book was fear of Black people in his neighborhood. All the crimes inflicted against him, all the violence that he experienced was at the hands of Black people, not at the hands of white police cops, not at the hands of white racists who were emerging en masse on his neighborhood. So it's a very, very strange story. He wants to say that Black on Black crime and that the disproportionate number of crimes committed by Blacks in this country is the fault of white people. And I was just not buying that sort of story at all.
We'll go back to your story, because you emigrated to this country from Jamaica, as I kind of alluded to before, about 3 decades ago. So what about your story and the story of those that you worked with and studied with, coming up through the ranks to do what you wanted to do, which was become an academic, which you did? What about those stories? What was your story?
Well, I came here in 1985 at the age of 20, and I came here with, my brother and I had decided that we wanted to leave Jamaica. It was too small, too provincial, too parochial. And my mother, at the age of 39, had decided that her boys were too young. And so she gave up her entire career in banking and dragged my 72-year-old grandmother along and said, well, I'm coming along to look over your shoulders. And my brother said, absolutely not. So he joined the military within 2 weeks of coming to America. And I stayed on in Atlanta and put myself through college. I worked up to 3 jobs. I was working 45 hours a week and going to school full-time also at the same time. It was terribly difficult. My mother didn't have money to put us through school, so I was basically financially responsible for my life. And she was there also to make a life for herself. There were more economic opportunities here in America. She was a banker by profession, but at that time there were just any number of banks in Jamaica, and she sort of wanted to rise for herself in the corporate world. And I basically had an enormous struggle. I cannot describe how difficult it was in those early years in America, working up to 3 jobs, surviving on 4 hours of sleep each night. And I never applied for any kind of governmental aid because, for prideful reasons, I just never thought it was...
You paid as you went.
I paid as I went. And there were moments when I thought that it could not be done. Incidentally, I graduated magna cum laude within just under 4 years of working full-time hours and going to school full-time. And then I took 2 years off from school after that, and I subsequently won a scholarship to do my PhD at Purdue, and did my PhD in about 4.5 years. and then went on to become a professor after that.
And despite the fact that so you landed in Atlanta, as you said, 1985, we were talking off camera a little bit about some of your neighbors in those first few years didn't perhaps share the same cosmopolitan worldview of people of different backgrounds that you had. And so a little bit of that experience, because one of the things that you wrote in your piece that we were referencing that struck me was saying effectively that I've never actively fought racism in my life, essentially, is what you're saying. And I wanted you to kind of distill that statement in the context of the some of the racist attitudes you experienced when you first got to America.
Well, we moved to Stone Mountain, which was traditionally known as Ku Klux Klan County.
Yeah, so it wouldn't
Right.
be the obvious place for you to move.
Right.
Right.
But Caribbeans, I have to tell you a story that the garment industry in the United States was integrated by Jamaican women in the 1920s because they saw a sign that said coloreds need not apply. And thinking hubristically or arrogantly that, oh, this obviously does not apply to us, they marched in en masse into the garment industries and applied for these jobs and integrated the garment industry over a period of maybe 5 years. So Caribbeans strategically thinking, oh, well, life in downtown Atlanta is very expensive. Cost of living is very expensive.
Mhm.
There's this place called Stone Mountain where you can get enormous houses and gigantic lawns, and the resale value on these homes are amazing. And we're going to move there. And no one group has a coercive monopoly on opportunities in America. And if members of the Klan, and we're not stupid, we know who the Ku Klux Klan were, but fearlessly, we thought we're moving there, and we're not social activists. We're not here on a social mission. We're here for economic opportunities. We're here to get a bit of the American dream. We're not here to disrupt anybody's way of life. And we had neighbors who were members of the Klan. And my grandmother, who was raised by a Jewish father, but who was, for all practical purposes, Catholic, wanted a Catholic church.
Mhm.
By the end of the year, she was the most famous parishioner in that all-white church. They loved her, and they wanted to know where Jamaica was, and some of them expressed an interest in visiting there and wanted to know what I wanted to do with my life. And I said I was going to be a philosopher, and they wanted to know, well, is that like psychology? And I said, well, there is some overlap.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I must say that I didn't experience any kind of blatant racism at all. I'm not sure what they thought of me privately, but one of the things I do like about the South and still like about the South is that people practice good manners and civility among these people. I'm sure among some of not all the members of Stone Mountain
Well,
were
right.
Klan members, right?
Right.
But I'm sure even among some of these people who were members of the Klan, there was an attempt to display a public face of civility towards your neighbors.
Do you think part of it was too? They just so there's this I mean, obviously racism is rooted in ignorance, and so there's this boogeyman you conjure about people that are different than you, and then you and your grandma show up,
And my mom.
and your mom, and it doesn't fit the caricature in my mind, and so maybe I stop thinking the caricature is reflective of reality, and I just stop being ignorant, stop being so ignorant because I've been informed that I'm wrong.
I think that's partially what was going on also. The proximity effaces or erases a kind of willed ignorance that you might have had previously about certain groups of people. And you have no choice but to sort of eradicate yourself or divest yourself of those beliefs.
And then so when you say that, again, referencing the piece, that never been an activist to fighting racism in your life, you that's not to say that you're not concerned about racism, you don't recognize its existence. It's to say you choose to attack it a different way.
Yes, I'm an intellectual activist. I'm not a social activist. I adduce myself as evidence of its absolute stupidity, that is racism, as a sort of psychosis, a failure to recognize the humanity in another person. And I cultivate certain virtues in my character, certain moral virtues, and I cultivate excellence in my character and in my abilities to perform well. I think God blessed me with certain cognitive gifts that I'm fairly intelligent, and whatever tasks are at my disposal, I execute them very, very, very well and competently. and better than most people, black or white. I just think I'm a very efficacious person who does the job very well and earns the respect of those for whom I'm doing a task, whether they're black, white, or Asians, right?
Because you can use the word efficacious properly. I mean, that's prima facie evidence. But I mean, but here's the thing. Going back to Jamaica just for a second, because this is so interesting to me, the integration of the garment industry. But also, there was this moment in the London Olympics back in 2012. Usain Bolt, your countryman, fastest man in the world. He's interviewing with a woman from a Spanish television station, and the national anthem starts to play. Our national anthem, United States national, Star Spangled Banner. And she continues to talk, and then he kind of like, is this live? Hold on a second, the anthem's playing. And he turned to pay, I mean, this couldn't be more important contextually what's going on in the NFL, for example. And he turned to pay attention
to the American
and respect the American national anthem.
Yeah.
I thought that was such an interesting moment. I mean, it was a great moment. It said something about America and Usain Bolt's views on America. But I just wanted to get your take on that because it was such an interesting moment for a foreign national to pay that kind of deference to America.
Yeah, but people undermine. I mean, we live in an era in which a great deal of unconscionable lip service is paid to the sort of hatred with which America is met with in foreign countries. But America still is this beacon of hope and love and admiration for a lot of people. And I know in Jamaica, America is not. I mean, my mother lives there now. She retired there, and I go back there to see her quite often. And I know that America is a very beloved country in America, in Jamaica, that people still admire this country. People still think of it as a place where if one doesn't aspire to live there, one still thinks of it as the embodiment of certain virtues, thrift, frugality, grit, hard work. I mean, America established, for heaven's sake, the modern work ethic that millions around the world aspire to. And the belief that if you really, really work hard, that there is something called a benevolent universe out there that will reward you. That if you're rational, that if you think of yourself first and foremost as an individual, which I think most Jamaicans do, they're not a terribly clannish people, right? They're rugged individualists in their own way. They're not a very race-conscious people. They're conscious in other ways, like in terms of class. And that America represents this for them, right? This is why the poorest among them can come here. Like there was this guy who used to cut my mom's lawn, and he came here around the same time as we did. And he bought this really cheap lawnmower that he was cutting my mother's lawn. And to cut a very long story short, he acquired a new lawnmower and was cutting the two neighbors' lawns within 3 months. In typical Jamaican fashion, at the end of a year, he had acquired a tractor mower and was mowing the entire subdivision.
Right.
After 2 years, guess what? He had 5 tractor mowers and 3 Mexicans working under him, and bought a house twice the size of my mother's, and was bringing over his entire Jamaican family.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's this Weber's so-called Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism, but it's not limited to Protestants.
No. Right. So when people talking about, and Tanisha Coates is one of these people who, along with very far left liberals, who talk about capitalism being the enemy of black people and poor people. All the immigrants I saw, and there were so many of them who came over in droves from Jamaica, they took advantage of capitalism. They didn't think of capitalism as their enemy. They took the free enterprise system, the free market system, as their friend, as offering opportunities that would allow them to open their flower stores, their supermarkets, their small businesses.
You mentioned a Vietnamese gentleman you came up with.
Thai.
Yeah.
A pseudonym, yeah.
And he opened a restaurant. Right?
Yes.
He worked his ass off to then be able to open his own restaurant.
Only went to college to learn English. He decided that I'm not academically inclined. I'm not going to get a college degree, which he did 20 years later. But went to, enrolled in classes just to improve his English. And he came over here speaking zero English. He was stuffing envelopes in a bank alongside myself because that's what he was qualified to do. And he convince the bank to give him a loan.
So I mean, the phrase that is used often is the soft bigotry of low expectations, and it seems like Coates and the far left are guilty of this. But you characterize it a different way. I thought it was a nice way of phrasing it, the way that you did in your piece and commentary. Talk about the belief that you have no power in your own emancipation.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially what Coates and those who share that worldview are arguing. And yet, all around us, we see examples of people of all different races and cultures, come from all different countries, and you make mention of the Jewish people specifically, and the
Yes.
persecution they've endured, and look at and the success they've had as a people,
Yes.
generally speaking, in terms of independence. And so what is the end game of advancing the idea that that Coates advances, that black families have no power in furtherance of their own emancipation, but all these other people do? What's that? Where does that go?
Well, where it creates a managerial far left liberal class that empowers them in their own feeling of. First of all, I think it reinforces their own sense of whiteness and indebtedness, that other people are indebted to them as white people in this country. And I think that's why I said, if I've gotten any kind of really racial, what people like to use, liberals like to use the term structural racism.
Right.
And if I've
Institutional,
gotten institutional, if I have experienced in 32 years in this country any kind of structural racism or institutional racism, it's really come within the configuration of the progressive far left, because I had no victim story to tell them. I've never been a victim. I never will be a victim. It's not part of my psychological makeup. And it was, how dare he, how dare you not be dependent upon us?
Right.
How dare you be so prideful? And how dare you think that without our help that you can actually make it? When I came to America, unlike Coates, I said, I demand one thing of Americans. Fundamentally, I do not need your help, because in a free society, talented people basically don't need anyone's help. They make their own way. Just stay out of my way and do not place any obstructions in my path against any efforts that I execute on behalf of enhancing my life. I think people on the far left don't like to hear that. They like to interfere, and they like to feel needed. And there's a psychology of liking to feel, because many of them suffer from a sense of social irrelevance and social insignificance. And the only way they can feel empowered, not all of them, I'm not generalizing here, but a significant number of them on the very far left, feel that the only way they can feel socially significant is by helping a powerless, inefficacious group of people who have no agency. And it's by stifling and crippling that agency that you create basically a symbolic plantation class over whom you exercise some kind of control.
Yeah, that's it, right. Essentially, they strip a human being of agency. They expropriate, I expropriate your agency to me so I can represent you against the world.
Yeah.
And the thing, I just want to expand on this for a minute, because I know people think, oh, it's the rugged individualist, this kind of apocryphal story, the rugged individualist who doesn't need anybody, like like it's a Clint Eastwood movie.
Yeah.
That's not what we're saying. I don't hear you saying that. Here's what I hear you saying, but I want to clarify this because this gets misinterpreted. This does not say I don't achieve success with the help of others, but I engage others collaboratively, freely, on my own terms. I don't need somebody from a particular agency directing me and telling me who I can go to for help and who I can't go to for help, and thrown together with somebody I don't want to be thrown together. When you say make your own way, you make your own way to work with people. You work with your students, you work with your colleagues at DePaul, you work with administrators. So it's not, I'm an island.
Right.
It's I'm doing this my own way, but of course I'm going to do this in collaboration with other people who I think can advance me, and I can help advance them, right?
And we're doing it as traders.
Yeah, right. Mutually beneficial exchanges.
Exchanges, exactly.
And
right.
so this is important, because it's not the whole kind of, you didn't build that, meaning somebody built their business on their own without any help. No, nobody does anything completely on their own. Family, friends,
Exactly.
right? But you do so on your own terms, and that's something that the left doesn't seem to be able to get its mind wrapped around.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to kind of clarify that point. One of the other, but going back to what you have or have not experienced, I want to hear what you've experienced on the campus of DePaul, because that is not exactly, a bastion of Russell Kirkism. 17 years at DePaul, you're a tenured professor, but particularly maybe over the last 10 years, although, gosh, I mean, the march of political correctness has been going on since even before you got to DePaul. It's just increased in pace. But how have you been received by students, by fellow faculty members? I suspect what you're saying and what you have written is not exactly center cut in the philosophy department at DePaul or among philosophy students at DePaul.
Well, DePaul as an institution is a wonderful place. As a Catholic institution, it's a wonderful place in helping, for example, disadvantaged students. I respect the institution enormously, and I feel very proud to be teaching there. I have an amazing relationship with my students, and they treat me with the utmost respect. And I'm not a doctrinaire teacher in the classroom. I'm not an ideologue in the classroom. I'm against the complete politicization in the classroom, right? So my function is to be a scholar and to be a representative and a spokesperson of the thinkers whom I'm teaching in the classroom. And I really resent enormously what's taking place in the humanities in general, especially among, again, far-left professors who have a profound hatred for America and sort of anti-American sentiment where they preach hatred of capitalism, hatred of reason, and politicize the classroom overtly. So among my students, I've had a really amazing experience. My colleagues are cordial to me. I had
They
I was-
don't punch me in the faculty lounge. Oh,
no,
that's nice.
well, I'm
Yeah.
something of an outlier
Yeah,
because I'm something of an
yeah.
outlier, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm an advocate of it's. I make no mistake about it. I'm an advocate of capitalism, and most people in the humanities are not. They're self-styled Marxists.
Right. They do
Or-
cash their checks every
They
2 weeks.
cash their
though.
checks, and
Yeah,
they live a
right.
very bourgeois lifestyle
Yes, right.
based on the endowments from rich corporate fat cats. I call them welfare scholars
Like that.
because that's what they are.
Yeah.
You know, they live off the largesse of these corporate grants, and then condemn and express hatred for the hand that feeds them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm something of an outlier because I'm someone who was influenced by libertarian thinkers. I was reading von Mises and Hayek and Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman and defenders of the free market system, and I was something of an oddball when I got there. So I think initially they didn't know what to do with me. I had a very difficult tenure battle 13 years ago, 14 years ago, which I fought and was very difficult for me personally. And
So they did. I mean, they did come at you when it was time for tenure. They did come at you and try and knock you out of the box.
there were attempts by a few people,
Yeah.
not the entire department, but there were a handful of people who did try to do some inflict some damage.
But as per usual, you were better than they were.
Well, I took the high ground. You know, as a black man, I could have said, well, I'm going to play the race card,
Yeah.
and lawyers contacted me and said, do you want to file a lawsuit? I said, no, I'm going to let my record speak for itself, because actually I'm out publishing so many of these people. At the time, I think I had more publications than my chair, which was a huge transgressive move on my part.
Sure.
The temerity of me, right?
To produce work.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's outrageous.
It's outrageous. It's preposterous. So the president did eventually grant me tenure, and the institution worked on my behalf. But I do feel, as a humanities professor, something of an outsider, and I do feel like one of the reasons my work hasn't been pushed as far as it could have been pushed is because I don't play racial politics. You know, I have a book, my third book, which is called When We Should Not Get Along. Can't remember the full name of it. No, it's escaping me. civil disobedience and the politics of identity when we should not get along, in which I vehemently argue against multiculturalism, against the politics of identity, against any kind of racial identity politics. And the book was received with horror,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
and people said, "How could you write this book?" And I said, "Well, it has to be written. Multiculturalism is destroying Europe. If it ever took foothold in America in the way that it's taken foothold in Europe, and we saw something like the application of Sharia law in America, and have these parallel societies existing in America, it would destroy America. Somebody has to write about these things." So I feel very much like an outlier, and I feel very much like an outlier when I talk about race also.
No, but I just want to go back to that you were exposed to libertarian thinkers, free market economists as a young man, and that somewhat shaped your viewpoints, I suppose. By the way, my dog is named Hayek, so that's how big a fan of Frederick von Hayek I am. But what about that? I know you're not an ideologue in class, but at Northwestern, the reading I did of von Mises and Hayek, even Friedman, Bastiat, outside of class reading, not part of the syllabus. What about for you? Do you expose students to Hayek and other thinkers that are, I mean, that's a Nobel Prize winner. It's not like this is some, phony baloney scholar.
That's right.
These are incredible intellects and deep thinkers who've contributed a lot of scholarship to Western society, Western civilization. But what about the exposure to thinkers, whether they're social scientists or kind of more heavy-duty economists like Ludwig von Mises? Do they get exposure in your class where they wouldn't at just about anywhere else?
They do. I make sure that while I'm teaching Thomas Hobbes, while I'm teaching Kant, Rousseau, that I do introduce some of these thinkers into my classroom, because I think my class is the only place where they are going to get exposure to some of these counter ideas. And I teach them as judiciously, as objectively, and as dispassionately as I can. Here are the arguments. Here are the viewpoints. What are your rejoinders? What are your, counter arguments? And I do so. And especially when they come to my office hours, I say, here's my bookshelf. Here are the books. Go look them up. Go buy them. Check them out of the library. I think it's very important, because I think a lot of college kids are coming out of the humanities today with really deeply, I cannot emphasize strongly enough the anti-American sentiments that's being foisted on them by their college professors. It really befuddles the mind.
I want to go back to the academy. How concerned are you about the implications of this beyond just students being maleducated? I mean, if you go back, since they love to go back and invoke Hitler and the Nazis to compare that regime to anybody who disagrees with them about anything, why don't we go back to them for this purpose? The belief that this was the banality of evil, that it was ordinary Germans who got swept into the Third Reich, and they were the impetus for this fascist regime. When in point of fact, and this is how it always happens, fascism only works if all of the elites in charge of civil institutions fold in.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had philosophers like Heidegger who were instrumental, in addition to the industrial elites, in addition to a lot of the clergy, a lot of the Lutheran pastors that folded in, Martin Niemöller and a couple of others notwithstanding. But when you have the academy going down this path of totalitarianism as they're imposing it on college campuses, at least with respect to free thought and free expression, how concerned are you about the implications of that for our larger free society that exists outside of campus?
Very concerned, and also not too concerned, in the sense that once there are pockets of resistance open, once we still live in a free society in which we can be having conversations such as we are having now, in which a conservative liberal professor can be sitting here espousing counter ideas to those which exist in the academy, and I have tenure, so they can't fire me.
Right. That's hard won.
Right. Then, so long as there is one person left thinking rationally, committed to reason, individualism, capitalism, espousing counter ideas, then I do see hope, and I'm not alone. I think there are. I think there are many other people, but I think people are ashamed. I think people are ashamed to say, "I'm an American. I'm a patriot. I'm in the academy. I love this great country," because they've been browbeaten into
Yeah.
believing that it's a bad thing to love your country if you are an American intellectual, because you're in a minority, first of all, and you're going to be ostracized, and nobody wants to be an outlier and be lonely. It's, as Freud was right, we're herd and horde creatures who want the affirmation and the validation of our peers. I've never cared for respectability. I've never cared for that kind of affirmation, validation. I prefer it to come from the dictates of my own conscience and what I think is right. And I know that I'd rather be alone and stand alone than to condemn America, because I've lived here and I've seen the greatness of this country and the nobility of this country and the best within the best of its people.
So you're going to be Howard Rourke in The Fountainhead if you need to be.
If I need to be, absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Crispus Hartwell, he's a philosophy professor at Dickinson College. Maybe you know of him and his work. He references Richard Rorty and this whole idea of the attack on language and redefining everything. And once you start redefining things, you have to continue redefining them, because the belief from this kind of linguistic school of cultural Marxism is if you redefine the language, then you get to redefine society. You redefine the world we live in, because we have a new shared understanding of what institutions mean, even if they're 180 degrees from what they meant 15 minutes ago, right? And so this is one of the things that the left gets away with too, and perhaps this is a failure of people who are not schools of this thought to properly elucidate it for people so they see the scam that it is, in my opinion. But the idea, so this is why all you have to do is redefine words to be dog whistles, words to be racist, words to be all of the isms and evidence of all of the phobias. You never have to address any of the underlying material conditions.
That's right.
So racism is just about an improper thought or an improper expression. But in terms of, for example, actual public policy that prevents disproportionately minority kids from accessing schools that the affluent white kids get to access in places like Chicago, New York, and big cities, we don't have to worry ourselves about that because we've already got ourselves covered with redefining the language. And that divide between language versus actual material improvements in people's lives, this little two-step that the left plays with philosophy and the language, and it emanates from the academy.
It's a form of magical thinking, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And but how to combat that on college campuses, or at least with your colleagues? Do you think they know that they're running the scam, or they're just so enamored with their own self-esteem that that kind of closing these gaps in material opportunity is sort of secondary, and that's the dirty business of politicians?
Well, I think it's part of the mythology that the far left in the American Academy has constructed and has been constructing for a very, very long time, that makes me think that the biggest divide in this country is actually not between the rich and the poor. It's between the intellectual and the people, where the people are common sense, reason-oriented, practical-oriented, and the intellectuals are emotionally driven, sentimental, anti-reason, anti-individualistic. And the only reason that they can get away with it is so long as they are continue to be funded by their detractors. So long as I think business people who are funding the American universes by and large continue to allow this kind of nonsense to go on, then they will get away with it. And I'm writing a piece in which I'm sort of making an appeal to the American, you can't say businessman anymore, business person, to wake up.
The alumni donor.
To the alumni donor, yes.
And the big donor.
To wake up and realize exactly what your dollars are funding. They're funding people who are taking your money and then calling you exploiters, calling you detractors of the American dream, calling you the perpetrators of all sorts of crimes of which you're innocent. And I think unless there's a revolution or some sort of revolt that will hold these intellectuals accountable, see, they can spew all sorts of invectives and get away with it. Because, again, business people and corporate persons who finance our educational system are made to feel guilty for their wealth.
Right.
They're made to feel guilty for their greatness and for their accomplishments. It's something like what Rand called the sanction of the victim in Atlas Shrugged. And so long as you are made to feel guilty and to feel unworthy of your own achievements and your creation, you'll continue to indirectly, in a sort of masochistic way, finance or give a platform to those who condemn you, because you will constantly be seeking atonement and redemption and seeking to prostrate yourself before those whom you think have the higher moral ground.
Is there enough? Is it my hope, or is this actually happening? Because this is similar to a conversation I had with Amy Wax, who's a law professor at Penn, and she recently said basically the Ivy Leagues are unsalvageable. They need to be defunded, the Ivy League schools. And so other people, Jordan Peterson at the University of Toronto has made overtures in the same direction. The idea that you have got to impose a financial cost on universities for them to change their behavior and maybe some of their personnel. University of Missouri, after all of the unrest on that campus, and they saw a massive decline in enrollment, and they had to shut down a couple of residential halls. And so that's a material hit that they're taking, and that starts to have a negative spiraling effect too as word gets out. And so is that really the best path? I mean, if you want to make a material statement, then you're an alumni of a particular, even if you're a small donor, you're an alumni of a particular school that is tolerating intolerance, then go Galt.
That's right.
With respect to them.
Why should you be funding values that are completely inimical to the deepest core values that you yourself hold? I mean, we want an open forum in which diverse values are debated and expressed, right? In the name of academic freedom. But we don't want to be financing schools that are expressing overt hatred of America. There's a difference between being critical of America, and there's a difference between espousing ideas that are hateful.
And maybe when you see more evidence about the outcomes, the impacts this having, people will not just kind of allow their guilt to drive their decision making. This survey out last week from the Annenberg Foundation that 1 in 5 undergrads think it's okay to use violence to suppress offensive speech on campus. I mean, thinking about people sending their kids to schools that are $20, $30, $50, $60,000 a year, and your kid is coming out saying it's okay for me to go punch somebody who says something I don't like. Is that part of the civil society that you want to see projected into the future? And if it's not, then perhaps you should stop sending Junior to that particular school, and you should be spreading the word about that.
But you see, this is the problem of postmodernity and postmodernism, which has taught them that there is no such thing as truth. There are no rational and objective ways of reconciling disputing truth claims, and that the village idiot and his stupid opinion has as much equal weight as the expert. And so college students now think that their opinions hold as much weight as the viewpoint of a seasoned expert. And so the only way to reconcile the differences is with
force,
with physical force, and not with rational arguments, because they haven't been taught rational arguments. Because they've been taught that rational arguments is the creation of a hegemonic white imperialist system that has been coined by imperialist racists to oppress them. This is the kind of nonsense that they're taught by postmodernism.
And last question, the students that are coming to DePaul, which is a very good school, coming out of high school to DePaul, they prepared to do post-secondary work? Is some of this poison thinking that you're describing been inculcated at the K through 12 level or the 9 through 12 level? and they're coming to campus with that, or is it just the nature of where college campuses are in America, generally speaking today, that they're incubators for this kind of poison?
Well, I think DePaul is an exception because I think DePaul is still one of those good old-fashioned Catholic schools with a good mission. We only have 3 PhD programs, and I think it's still one of the last bastion. It's like, what's that college in St. John's College?
Oh, in Minnesota?
In Minnesota, yeah. It takes itself as serious as like one of the last bastions of civilization in a really bankrupt, intellectually and culturally bankrupt world that will send its students out into the world. It still believes in something like the great books, but it's receiving great pushback from, these crazy left-wingers who think that, I proposed to the president before he left that I would like to start something like a great book program, and he said it will never pass the faculty senate. It's just an old-fashioned, dated concept.
Right.
Because I wanted to head something like that, because I thought I wanted to give Columbia University, which has a great books program, and Notre Dame, which has a great books program, and have something like this at my institution. And he was all excited about it, but he said, we've been there before. So DePaul does face its own challenges.
Yeah. So C.S. Lewis has no place on the campus of DePaul. I mean, it's one of those things, right?
No,
I'm not saying him specifically, but he's like, you get down this road of wait, who are we again?
Right.
And again, I'm not necessarily singling out DePaul. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
No.
You have these Catholic universities that seem to tolerate a lot of anti-Catholicism, if not produce it. Notre Dame is a good example, and I've taken out after President Jenkins before on the topic. I mean, conferring the Latari Medal to Joe Biden. It's just not consistent with who you say you are, and if you're not going to be who you say you are, then people are going to recognize that.
Yeah, but it's an uphill battle when an institution has to stick to its mission statement, but also faces internal battle with its faculty. It's a delicate dance that has to be done. And it's not an easy one.
But perhaps there should be a little bit more front-end due diligence to make sure the hiring that's being done of faculty is of persons who understand and agree with the mission.
No, if I were president, I'd abolish the tenure system and be firing people left, right, and center, cutting whole programs, eliminating. The board of trustees would love me.
Yeah.
Because I'd be cutting programs, firing people. For making these egregious statements, for example. You have a right to your First Amendment, but you don't have a right to destroy the mission statement of an institution in your classroom. You can do it on your private property or the property of your adherents, but not on private property necessarily.
He is DePaul philosophy professor, future university president, maybe. Jason Hill, the piece that you want to check out is an open letter to Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's in Commentary Magazine. And any other forthcoming work that you want to telegraph so that people can follow more of your work if they don't have time to audit your class over in Lincoln Park?
I have an interesting book called Becoming a Cosmopolitan, which was my first book 17 years ago that's still selling, about what it means to be a global citizen in the 21st century. And a forthcoming piece that's based on this article. That's written as a letter to the American people, which is really extolling the virtues of this great nation. That's forthcoming early next year. So look out for that piece.
Very good.
That small book.
Well, we're happy Grandma and Mom brought you and your brother over to this country. Professor Hill, thanks so much for joining us on this Against the Current. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.